Hi everyone, welcome to Knit Together with Kim and Jonna, but this is only Kim. We recently, since the new year, we're starting to do these shorter videos, and we're calling them Catching Up with Kim or Catching Up with Jonna. Jonna did one earlier this month, and now it's my turn. And they're kind of in the vein of Vlogmas because we had so much fun doing Vlogmas. So right now you're catching up with Kim, and you're probably wondering where I am. Well, a couple weeks ago, I was contacted by my previous job. I think I've mentioned that I've taught gymnastics and nursery school, and this is the nursery school that I taught in. And for most of my day, I taught Mommy and Me gymnastics classes in this room right here. And they contacted me a couple weeks ago to see if I could sub a few classes. And I did, and it's been really fun. I hadn't been here teaching since before COVID. And then the person I was subbing for, the person who took my position, was away last weekend, and then she came back from her little vacation with COVID. So I'm subbing this week as well. So this is where I worked for 15 plus years. I worked there's a big gym as well. I worked there for the first 5 years I was here, but it's really fun. I sing songs and teach little children with their mommies how to do forward rolls and all kinds of fun things. So as you can tell, it's a really fun place to work, just the bright colors and just being around children all day. So this morning I just finished teaching 3 classes in a row. So I'm a little tired. I didn't change my clothes. After working here for so many years, I ended up just every day wearing all black. Kind of boring, but at least I didn't have to think about it. So black leggings, black t-shirt, black, what's it called? Like a little zipper jacket in case it gets chilly. But anyway, so that's where I am. Anyway, in addition to that, before COVID, I had started teaching an after-school program here called Knitwits. I created the program, and the children who live in this town can just take the school bus here after school, the kindergarten through 5th graders, or if they're from another town, they can be driven here, and once a week, I teach them how to knit. And I've talked about it a little bit here and there. I've posted on Instagram, and people have had a lot of questions. So I'm just gonna, right now we just finished yesterday, in fact, our 4th week. It's an 8-week program, and I'm just gonna go over basically what I teach them. And a lot of people learn from their grandparents, from their parents, but a lot of children don't have relatives who knit. So it's been really fun. Some of the other offerings for after-school programs are like slime, and can't even think. There was karate at one point, and what else? Sometimes they do like a cooking class. So one thing I love about teaching them knitting is it's a lifelong skill. Even if they don't keep doing it, even if they don't seem interested now, eventually they might pick it up and remember even the little bit that I taught them. Unlike slime, I'm assuming most people will not still be making slime when they're 50 years old, at least for themselves, maybe for their families. But anyway, if you hear voices around, normally the school is full of bustling activity, but it's supposed to snow today, so there was an early dismissal. So a lot of the teachers are getting ready to leave. The kids have all left the building. And I thought it would be fun, instead of going home and filming this video in my boring house, instead to just film it here. So you can kind of get another picture of my life, especially before the channel. So anyway, when I teach the kids knitting classes, I start with finger knitting, and I am going to attempt for this video to record a finger knitting tutorial. But when they first get to class, they take various buses here. So until their bus arrives, I found online a few color pages. So I have a color page waiting for them when they get there, and colored pencils, and they can color their coloring page. And this one actually is part of the lesson of the first week about the various tools we use for knitting, and just various color pages that I found online and I printed. And so when they first get here, they can color these coloring pages, unless they've already learned a skill and they say, hey, I'd rather finger knit, then they can do that. But in case they don't want to, because it's an hour class and kids can get really bored in an hour and don't always want to finger knit the whole time. But the first week's lesson is about knitting tools, and I bring a tray full of various knitting tools. So like yarn, needles, scissors, what else is on here? Buttons, Obviously knitting needles. These look like safety pins, but I call them stitch holders. But all kinds of things, and they get to touch all the different tools and look at all of them, so that's really fun. Then I teach them finger knitting. They don't always get it by the end of the first day. I do give them each a stitch holder. So at the end of the class, they can take their finger knitting home, because obviously if they just take it off their hands, it's just going to unravel. And the reason I chose the version of finger knitting that I chose is because I found a handout that illustrated it. I did not create this handout. But this is the style of finger knitting I teach. There are other ways to teach finger knitting. I'm sure you can find tutorials. That's where I found mine. But this is the style I teach. So when I do the tutorial, which I'll probably put maybe at the end of this video, I guess, if I can figure out how to do it, this is the style of finger knitting that I teach them. And I eventually teach them that finger knitting is flat, because the next lesson I teach them after 2 weeks of finger knitting is spool knitting, and we create our own French knitting spool. And let's see, do I have mine here? So we do 2 weeks of finger knitting. And actually, let me go back. So the first week we talked about knitting tools. The second week I bring in yarn in all the different shapes you can purchase it in. I bring in at least one of each of these shapes. And so there's still an opening coloring page that they color, but then when they're all there, ready to go, I bring out this coloring page, and I bring out of my bag one of these samples, like a hank or a cone, and I ask them, which one is this? And then they color it. And one thing that was cute this time I did it was each yarn obviously is a different color, so I thought they would just color with their favorite color, but they started matching the color of the pencil with the color of the yarn that I pulled out of my bag. And one of their favorite ones, one reason I like this handout, is the Hankenstein down here in the bottom, the Tangled Mess. And already now some of their own yarns for their projects have become Hankensteins, so we have to untangle their yarn. So I talked to them about just keeping their yarn in order. You'll hear people walking by, so don't worry about it. But anyway, so that's the second week. And then the third week, I bring in toilet paper rolls, popsicle sticks, and masking tape, and we make our own French knitting spools. And then I number. The numbers are going to be backwards because I'm on my iPhone. Oh, someone's going out the door. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I teach them how to use a French knitting spool. So they get a new ball of yarn, and this time I used rainbow yarn, and they love it, and it's really fun. And so at this point I teach them and I show them how hand knitting is flat knitting. There's a front and a back, and spool knitting is round knitting in the round. It's a complete circle, like an I-cord. And it was so cute. Yesterday when we had class, this one little girl came in. Honestly, kids are very overscheduled. So a lot of times I'll teach them and I'll encourage them to practice, but they don't even take their knitting out of their bag. Even my own granddaughter, she's in the class. She doesn't take her knitting out of the bag the entire week and then comes back the next week, but that's fine. But this week, a little girl came in and she had 2 big, long pieces of spool knitting. First, she had done a whole bunch, and then after she went to bed, her mom did a whole bunch. It's so cute. So when she brought that in, it really inspired the other 3 children to want to do theirs. So for the rest of the class, the other kids did finger knitting or spool knitting. That is not common. Typically, I always have a lesson planned because I assume they're going to get bored with it and just not want to continue. But yesterday, I couldn't get them to stop finger knitting and spool knitting. So one thing about the finger knitting, as I said, when they leave the class that day, they have the yarn on 4 fingers. I give them each a stitch holder, and I show them how to take it off of their fingers and then close the little, it's like a safety pin, right? Close the little stitch holder and take it home. And then I teach them how to put it back on their hands. And then obviously for spool knitting, they don't have to take it off to leave. So they just leave it in there. I just tell them to be careful so the stitches don't fly off. But this week also, I taught them how to bind off. And so I gave them each, I don't have one here, but a little plastic tapestry needle. And I taught them how to cut the yarn, thread the needle, and run it into each stitch, both in their finger knitting and on their spool knitting, so that they can tie it off and finish their knitting. So that was fun. I did teach them that. And then what I tell them is if you do practice, eventually you can make yourself a scarf. So this is 3 strands of very messy finger knitting. I can't remember why it was so messy. This was from a few years ago. And if they make like 3 strands of about 36 inches, or one long one, 90 inches, I braided them together. So that's a braid, you can't really tell. And we made a scarf. Because for a small child, I Googled it, how long is a scarf for a small child? And it's about 30 inches. And so that's fun. And then later in the session, I'll teach them how to make fringe, and we'll put fringe on their little scarf. But even if they only have a little piece of finger knitting done or a little piece of spool knitting, we'll put fringe on it so they can learn how to make fringe. And that one was finger knitting. This one is spool knitting. Spool knitting looks much, much neater. And I use bulky yarn, or super bulky. So this was obviously 3 strands. And then I braided them together. And then, of course, we add fringe, which is really fun. I did have a lesson planned for this week, but because they were so excited about finger knitting and spool knitting, I didn't even teach the lesson. So it'll be a good thing to save, because next week they get their knitting needles, their little knitting kits, and that can be frustrating for them, as I'm sure you can imagine. It can be very frustrating. So I can always, if we're getting frustrated, I can stop and teach the lesson that I have planned. So what I do, I have this other lesson planned about yarn weights, and I give them a blank sheet, and then I have cut lengths of each yarn weight, and I give them a little pile of each yarn weight, and they match them to mine, or they can guess, and then they just tape them to their worksheet. So that's another little lesson that I do with them. And then in conjunction with that, I also bring in the different sizes of knitting needles, and I talk about how different weights of yarn need a different size of knitting needle. So I have a whole packet of each size from 1 to 17, various kinds, circular, straight, double pointed, and then they can put them in order. I bring one of the little, the little thing that you can get where you can stick the needle in the holes to see what size it is, because some of them it's written on it, and obviously we know some of them it isn't, or it's really hard to see. So I let them use that little tool and put all the needles in the number order. That's another lesson that I can pull out of my magic knitting bag if I have to. But anyway, just to finish off this video, I've tried various things with teaching them to knit, buying my own yarn and needles, trying to come up with things for them to knit. And one day I was in Pick Up Every Stitch and I saw this magical thing, the Sandnes Garn knitting kit. It's actually called Sandnes Barn, and there's a place to put their name. And it does close, but mine is stuffed full of things. But I started buying these to teach them how to knit. So next week, on the 5th week, for the last 4 weeks of class, they'll receive this knitting kit. And I absolutely love it. It comes with 2 balls of yarn. It comes with Frited's garn, because there are 2 projects in here that can be felted. So Frited's garn is good felting. Actually, I made slippers with this yarn recently, last year, I think. And it comes with a set of knitting needles. Here are mine. They're not in the packet right now because I was using them. They're really cute little knitting needles. And it also comes with a little booklet. Now, honestly, in the past, I have still just tried to teach them my own way of knitting. I knit continental, the German style with my finger up. Jonna knits more the Norwegian style with her finger down on the needle. There is no right way, but I've kind of taught them that way because that's the way I do it. But then I realized, just for teaching this session after COVID, because obviously I've had a couple years to think about it, why don't I just teach exactly what's in this booklet that comes with the knitting kit? Why reinvent the wheel? So I went through this time. I hadn't done this before, even though I have used these knitting kits. I went through and read the entire booklet, and I am going to teach them. There's, I think, 5 projects they can make, from easy to a little bit more difficult. But I'm teaching them how to do the cast on that's in the book. Why reinvent the wheel? I used to cast on for them, but then they're kind of stuck. So I'm going to try this session. We'll see how it goes. Next week, they're going to learn to cast on. And that's why they can get a little bored, and that's why I have extra projects ready and waiting. And then there's a page that teaches them how to do knit stitches, and I'm going to teach them this way instead of my own way. I'm going to teach them this way. And Sandnes Garn is a Norwegian company, so I'm assuming this is a very Norwegian way. It is kind of Jonna's style with the finger. It is continental, but with the finger down on the needle, and that's fine. Again, why complicate and reinvent the wheel? And it also teaches how to bind off. And I love the little projects. I also decided this time to make each of the projects ahead of time to inspire them. Why didn't I think of this before? You know, you live and learn. So I started knitting all the little projects at home before. Yesterday, I kind of showed them my progress so they could get inspired. But this is for the little fingerless mitts. So they have to just knit 2 little squares like this in garter stitch and then sew up one side. So during class yesterday, I sewed up one side and showed them how it's a little fingerless mitt, and I let them each try it on, and they all wanted to wear it and take it home. They loved it. I think that'll be so inspiring for them to not give up and to start knitting. So, so yes, these are for the fingerless mitts. And then there's also a project, they call it a pencil case, but you make kind of a rectangle like this, and then you fold up the bottom and sew it here, and then you fold down the top and you put 2 buttons here. And I'm assuming, I don't think it says that you just pull the button through the cast on or the bind off edge, but isn't that cute? And I thought it would be cute to braid a long string and attach it, and it could be like a little purse. That's so cute. So I will finish that for next week to show them next week. And then there's also a headband, and I just did it the length they said in the book. But obviously each child can make it as long as they need to fit their head, but I'll sew this together for next week. So a headband. And then the other 2 projects I haven't knitted yet. One is a pair of slippers. Yes, these cute little slippers that can be felted or not felted. They encourage them to make them one size bigger if they're going to felt them. So I will make a pair, and I'll probably felt one of the slippers and not felt the other, and just to show them. And then the final project is a like a little, I don't want to show you the pattern, but it's a little, I mean, it's kind of like, they show it kind of like a pillow, but it's not stuffed. So it's 4 squares, 2 are plain and 2 are striped. So that's what makes it a little bit harder, is because it's striping. You don't have to stripe, you can make them all plain. And then they would learn to seam them together. And the cute little picture of it is a child kind of resting with their head on it. Oh, and here are the little slippers. So they also show an option for the slippers to knit them striped. So again, that's a little more advanced. So then if a child, let's say, actually one of the moms asked, the one who did the spool knitting, when's the next session? When does it end? Because she wants her child to continue. If they continue for another session, they can just pick right up and keep knitting where they left off. And I can teach them more advanced skills. What I'm going to do probably is not have them start immediately with a project. This is what I've done in the past. I have them just start knitting a swatch with maybe 10 to 15 stitches. And when they've knitted about 4 inches, 10 centimeters, then, you know, obviously they'll have less and less mistakes as it goes, and then they can start one of the projects. But then in the future, if they continue with the class, we can keep their little swatch with live stitches. And then if I want to start teaching them new stitches, I can teach them increases and decreases and yarn overs and things like that. So we'll do that on the swatch. So almost like a sampler, you know, those old embroidery samplers they used to have. I like to have this sampler swatch that we keep working on. I've had this in the past before COVID, where children have continued. And so on this swatch, I've taught them ribbing, obviously teach them to purl. I mean, that's the first thing after knitting that I teach them, how to do stockinette stitch. And so we do these things on their swatch. And then at the same time, they can still be knitting a project on the side. Or if there's a skill in the project that's a little more complicated, because once they finish with their initial project, their moms can take them to a yarn shop and get another knitting project. And so a lot of times not all the time, what I will do is, if there's a skill in the knitting project that they need to learn, then I'll teach it to them first on their swatch. So this swatch, they start that first, in that week 5, will just continue to grow and grow and grow and show their progress, show how they make less mistakes, show how their stitches get more even, and show all the different things they've learned. So basically, That's my kids' knitting class in a nutshell. And I really love doing it. And yeah, so this week I basically talked about the first 4 weeks of class. And I haven't taught the knitting yet now since COVID. So we'll see how it goes. And I'll update you maybe in next month's video. But that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I really do hope that I will be able to figure out how to do this tutorial. And at the end of this video now, you will see a video on finger knitting, the style I teach, and also on how to make the knitting spool and spool knitting. Okay, thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye. Hi, and welcome to my finger knitting tutorial. Today, all you're going to need is some yarn, and I prefer bulky or super bulky yarn. You'll need a stitch holder, scissors, and a tapestry needle. Let's get started. Start by putting your tail behind your thumb, and then we'll make our first row. Bring your yarn in front, behind, in front, behind. Wrap it around your pinky, behind, in front, behind. That's row 1. Make sure it's not too tight. Row 2, in front, behind, and around, behind, in front, behind. I always rest my yarn across the palm of my hand in between rows, and then we're ready to pull our first stitches over. Be aware that your very, very first stitch is not really attached to anything. It's your tail, so don't pull too hard. There we go. After each row, you push your stitches back down to the base of your fingers, and then I do recommend you gently pull on your tail. It neatens everything up. Next row, always make sure you're putting the yarn above the previous stitch, not below. So above, in front, behind, around, behind, in front, behind, and pull it over. If it's too tight, it will be very hard to get these stitches over your fingers. Notice I bend my fingers to pull them over. Makes it a little bit easier. Gently pull on my tail. In front, behind, in front, behind and around, behind, in front, behind. And then you just keep going. You can go as long as you want. And just push it down. Gently pull. Front, behind, in front, behind. There we go. I'll do a couple more rows. There. One thing I want you to notice is that because finger knitting is flat, your hand is flat, the finger knitting is flat, there is a wrong side and a right side, and the right side looks so pretty. I love it. But the right side faces the back of your hand. We'll have to remember that later. Actually, let's remember it now, because if you want to take a rest, you need to obviously take the stitches off your fingers. I use a stitch holder. You can also use a pen to do it, especially a pen with a little, one of those little clip things to put on a pocket, because then you can slide the stitches underneath. But the stitches can wait there and you can put it aside. Now, if you decide to pick it up again and start again, then just remember to put the right side facing the back of your hand. And then I slide the stitches on in reverse order. So I started with my pinky and ended with my index finger, and I'll slide them back on in reverse order, like that. And then you're ready to go again. Another interesting thing to note is that when you're getting ready to start, it seems a little strange that your feeder yarn is coming out from your middle finger. You would assume it would come out from your index finger. but it doesn't. And the reason why, so once you get them back on your hand, you bring it around to rest. But you'll notice front, back, around, back, front, back. Your last stitch really is coming from your middle finger. And that's why when you get ready to start again, it can seem a little confusing that the feeder yarn is coming from your middle finger here instead of your index finger. Anyway, so lastly, if you want to finish, you can bind off in more of a traditional way. You can put this one on here and pull this one over and continue. This one on here, pull it over, this one here and pull it over. But more recently, because it's only 4 stitches, what I've been doing is using a tapestry needle and just running the yarn through the remaining 4 stitches. So you can just cut your yarn, leaving enough to weave in the end. Thread your tapestry needle, and then just the same way that you took the stitches off of your fingers to save them, you can do the same thing. Just take them off and maybe I'll put this behind. Pull it tightly. And then I tend to like to go through the stitches one more time. And pull it tightly, and you're done. There's your finger knitting. Thanks for watching. Welcome to my spool knitting tutorial. I am going to teach you how to make your own knitting spool. I'll teach you that at the end of the video. And I'm also going to teach you how to use it. And I like to use bulky or super bulky yarn. It just looks nicer and it tends to go a little faster as well. But you start by putting the tail down through the center of your knitting spool and hold it with your thumb so it doesn't slip away. Then from the center, you come up and around stick number 1, around stick number 2. You always go behind first, around stick number 3, behind around stick number 4, behind around stick number 5, behind around stick number 6. And that's 1 row. Make sure they're always pushed down. Then we need a second row in order to actually, or at least a second stitch in order to actually do any knitting. So we bring the yarn behind again and around stick 1. And then I'm going to hold both my tail and my feeder yarn as I pull this first stitch over because it's not attached to anything but the tail. So if I don't hold the tail, it will just pull away. And then I can release the tail and just hold the tail and pull it. I tend to pull it between every stitch. So then bring your yarn behind again, behind the next stick, which is 2, around and hold it. The reason I hold it here is because if I don't, as I'm pulling the bottom stitch over the top stitch can more easily slide off if I'm not holding it. Make sure your stitch is always pulled down to the base of the stick, and then you just keep going. Behind, around, hold it, and pull the bottom stitch over the top, and then pull the tail. Behind, around, hold, pull the bottom stitch over the top, and pull the tail. Behind, around, hold it, bottom stitch over the top, and pull the tail. That's 1 complete row of knitting done, and then you just continue. Behind, around, hold it, pull the bottom stitch over the top. Again, behind, around, hold it, bottom stitch over the top. Behind, around, hold it, bottom stitch over the top. And then you just keep going. Now I did another tutorial about finger knitting, which is also a fun, simple way to knit without having to use knitting needles, just like a spool knitting. or just like spool knitting. But finger knitting is flat knitting because your hand is flat. And spool knitting is circular knitting. As you can see, it's a complete circle. So it makes what we call an I-cord. It's really exciting when it starts to come out the bottom of your spool. Keep going. Now, if at any time that you want to stop your spool knitting and you're finished and you want to bind off, what I do is I just cut my yarn. I don't actually do a bind off. I just thread the end of my yarn onto a tapestry needle. And then I run it up and off and pull. Just make sure you're not pulling your other stitches off. Up and off and pull. I'm holding my finger here to keep the rest of the stitches on as I'm pulling each stitch off. And then the last one. And there it is. After I've run my yarn through all the stitches, I usually like to run it through the stitches again to secure it a little better. And there you have your spool knitting, this nice chunky I-cord. Love it. Now, how do we make this? I mean, you probably see just by looking at it. You take your toilet paper roll, and I like to use 6 sticks. I have my tape ready and waiting, and I just hold it in place. And then I place the other stick opposite and just wrap the tape around and make sure it's secure, because masking tape really isn't that sticky. So you definitely want to make sure it's pressed down. And then for this, the 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th, I just put them a third of the way. And then the other one opposite. Wrap it around to secure it. And then the last ones here. Oops, I said it wasn't sticky and then it stuck to my scissors. And then just wrap it around and secure it. Definitely want to make sure your tape doesn't go up over the top edge because it will stick to your yarn. And then it's just a little easier, especially for children, to do this if you number the sticks. And there it is. That's how you make your own knitting spool and knit with it. Thanks for watching. Bye.